I'd like to call this meeting to order, this special town board meeting at 7:01 on July 20th, Monday. I do have my American flag, and I'm going to, if you would all join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, place your hand over your heart. Here we go. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. Welcome to our meeting. We have two items on our agenda this evening. First, we'll have a presentation by our auditor, Andrew Arias, CPA. We'll be reviewing our 2019 audited financial report. And also, I think Michelle Lindsay will be leading us in a CFA public hearing. And Michelle, could you explain what the public hearing is about before we get started?
Well, what I had asked Donna to send out to everybody was a portion of the Consolidated Funding Application from 2019, so that people would see what we presented last year. This year, we are going to add the plans that were preliminary plans that Al Fusco had drawn up for the vehicle and traffic law changes. And he also, if we agree, will just give a very preliminary draft of what a parking lot at the post office lot would look like. Oh, you muted yourself.
Thank you, and thank you. I was thanking you for that, and we all look forward to hearing more after Andrew's presentation. So it is 7:03. I don't see the full participant list.
Let's see. Let's see if I can find it. I have Andrew, Brian, Donna, Jay, Ken, Maria, Mary Gretzer, and Paul Gluck.
Well, welcome, Mary and Paul. And I see we have our town board. So I think we should begin.
Dave. Is Dave here?
Oh, Dave is here. He's opened the meeting. Yes.
Oh, okay.
So I guess he's TT host.
Okay.
So yes, we have a full board here, and I think we should turn it over to Andrew.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me pull up the presentation. I'll pull it up so it's sort of easy to follow everyone looking right at it while I'm talking about it. So can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So briefly, I'm just going to go through the 2019 audit for the town of Tuxedo. Some of our findings, financial position, just sort of a brief summary of what we did during the course of the audit. So first of all, I always like to remind you that what we do as an audit, we come in, your audits are subject to what we call government auditing standards. It's a little bit different than a regular audit. We look at your financials, which is normal in most audits. There's a couple of things different with government audits is that we have to assess your internal controls. So we look at them, we determine whether they're working as planned. We make risk assessments based on whether your controls are effective or ineffective. So pretty much if your controls are bad, we can deem it as high risk and we have to do more work to come to our numbers. And vice versa if you have good controls in place. We also have to look at your compliance with laws and regulations. So this is a separate report you see in the back of the audit where we talk about your internal controls and your compliance with laws and regulations. Also, you're required to get a federal single audit if you expend over $750,000 in federal money. So basically, if a municipality spends over $750,000, we do a separate audit, which is called a single audit, where we look at your controls and compliance over federal programs. That was not required in 2019, so there was no requirement to have that audit done. And really, the only part of these financials that are ours is the opinion in the funds. Pretty much, we're giving our opinion on the fair presentation of the financial statements to an outside user. So we're saying when someone looks at these financial statements, are they misleading or are they fairly presented to the user? Just briefly, I want to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 issues. Obviously, we've had a lot of issues with some of the audits we've been working on, or some of the audits we hadn't started. Luckily, with the town of Tuxedo, we were into the town early to perform a lot of the work on site before all the shutdowns hit. So we were able to do a lot of our test work, field work, getting some of our numbers together before the shutdowns hit. And then a significant portion. Excuse me. Okay. A significant portion of the remaining audit was done remotely. So basically, we use a lot of reports that were provided to us remotely. Brian provided us with reports. Certain other items that we may not have gotten when we were originally there that we needed supporting documentation, the town personnel would have had to scan those documents and get them over to us. Now we've done several audits where we've done a lot of work remotely, and it does become a very cumbersome process. Luckily with Tuxedo, most of our work was done on site. We didn't have to do a lot of the remote work because it really creates a lot of work for your staff as well as ours in terms of getting, documents, scanning everything, getting them over to us. Luckily, the timing of when we went in there and when the shutdowns hit didn't really affect the audit too badly. So just going through your main operating funds, and pretty much, I think, as you all know, the town is in much better situation than it was several years ago. So we'll just sort of go where you are with all the funds. Your general A fund, you have a total fund balance increase for the year of $207,000. And you have a total fund balance of $1.54 million at the end of the year. You used 160 of that towards the 2020 budget, so you did appropriate some of that fund balance to sort of balance your 2020 budget. And you had no non-spendable fund balances. Now, your non-spendable fund balances, a big portion of your general fund non-spendable fund balance in previous years had to do with loans to the deficit, the other funds that had deficits. So if you recall, we talked about if the general fund may have had a good fund balance, but if they were owed $500,000 from the B fund and the B fund had no fund balance, we couldn't show that as sort of a fund balance that could be used by the general fund because the general B fund had no ability to pay it back. So that would have been shown as non-spendable fund balance. Another thing that's non-spendable would be prepaid ERS bills or prepaid expenses. The town did not prepay its ERS and PFRS bills this year. I would recommend in the future when you get those bills, pay them in December. You get a small discount. It can come up to a few $1,000s, but it's pretty much easy money. When I first took over the audit, the town didn't even have the cash to do that, so it wasn't even an option. But now certainly that the financial position is much better. I would, just remember at the end of the year when you get those bills, due in February, go ahead and pay them in December, and you get credit for them.
So Andrew, for those of us who are not all that accounting savvy, the ERS or the Employee Retirement System expenses, and you mentioned also the acronym for the police and fire.
Yes. So those are large bills you pay every year, obviously.
So is there some financial discount available when you pay earlier?
Yes.
Or is it just prudent to knock it out?
No, there's a financial discount. When you get the bill, it will tell you what's due if you pay in February and what's due if you pay in December. So certainly if you have the cash and the cash flow is available, which the town has, there's no reason not to pay it in December. It's free money. So just, go ahead and make sure you get those bills paid in December moving forward.
Would you guess that's something like a 1 or 2% incentive, or do you have any idea what the percentage would be?
Usually it's a couple of $1,000s. So I'm not sure, I don't know what it is percentage-wise. It's not a huge number, but
okay.
$1,200, $2,100, something like that. I mean, certainly it depends on the size of your bill, but it's money for doing nothing pretty much. Just paying the bill that you're going to pay 2 months later anyway, and you have the money. It doesn't affect your budget because the way we report the expense, we allocate it the bill to the period that's covered. So that bill that you're paying, whether you pay it in Friday in December or you pay it in February, we're only allocating 75% of that expense to this year because it covers the period from April to December and then the next 3 months of the next year. So it doesn't change anything in your budget or how the expenses are, but it just saves you a couple of $1,000s. So it's something you really should be doing. There's no reason not to do it.
Hi, can I ask you, it might be a naive question, but I am new at this.
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference between, when I looked at your presentation at home, what is the difference between expendable and non-expendable funds? Like a quick review.
Non-spendable?
Yeah.
Non-spendable is really, it's a portion of fund balance. So at the end of the year, think of it as a bank account. If the town of Tuxedo has $1 million in the bank, it's $1 million of fund balance. But then that fund balance is made up of different parts of fund balance. So as an example, if you're going to use, like this year, for instance, you used $160,000 towards the next year's budget. So now we say, okay, $160,000 is what we call appropriated fund balance. So we take that out of the million. Then if you have what we call prepaid expenses, so if you pay a $100,000 insurance bill in advance, that's an asset. It's a prepaid insurance. So it would show up as your fund balance, but it's really not spendable to you because as soon as the year turns over, the expense is going to get recognized. It's not money that you can spend. So that's why we show it as non-spendable. Really, it just means that it's a prepaid. The other portion of a non-spendable fund balance, which the town doesn't have anymore, and I mentioned, has to do with loans to other non-current receivables. If you have a loan out there that you're not going to get back within the next year, you have to show it as non-spendable because, again, that money then is not available for the town to spend. Trying to sort of show each aspect. And then if you had reserves, which I'll talk about a little bit later, you could have another component called restricted fund balance. And that would show, okay, out of $1 million, we have $100,000 in a capital reserve. That money is also set aside. So really at the end, what you're looking at is total fund balance and all the components of your fund balance.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay. And there is in the audit report, if you go through it in the notes to the financial statement, there is a section that explains an explanation for each type of fund balance. It's, sometimes it's a little bit, accounting terminology, but I think what I just said there was sort of the simple explanation for it. The unassigned fund balance, now with the unassigned fund balance, that means the portion that's left over that the town can spend on whatever they want going forward for the general fund. So again, it's not a prepaid expense, non-spendable, it's not restricted, it's not appropriated towards next year's budget. This is now what you have left. And that's the number that the state controller usually looks at when they're trying to determine what kind of shape municipalities are in. They look at their unassigned fund balance. The benchmark they use is percentage of subsequent year's expenses. So because obviously a dollar figure means nothing if one budget is $5 million and one budget is $500,000 in different funds. So you're always looking at a percentage of your budgeted expenditures. So the last 2 years, the town's been pretty consistent at 46% and 47% of the subsequent year's budgeted expenditures. Now, there's no statutory limit on that number. I don't know if any of you are familiar with school districts. They're limited to 4% of the subsequent year's budget. There's no such statutory limit for municipalities. However, what the state controller will say when they look at these municipalities is they think if you have about 10 to 20% of the subsequent year's budget, they say that's a reasonable number to have. Again, it still is the discretion of the town board. As to how much they want to keep in fund balance. There's no statutory, a state controller can't come and say you have to give that money back to the taxpayers or anything like that. But it is something to think about because if the state controller comes in and audits you, what they'll do a lot is if you have a very high fund balance, they'll write a report saying the town has too much fund balance and they're overtaxing the taxpayers. That's the way they'll phrase it. So it's just something to keep in mind, that 10 to 20%. And one of the ways that you can get back into that, if you have fund balance, and you don't want to keep just 10 to 20%, is setting up reserves because your reserves don't count towards that 10 to 20%. So if the town sets up a capital reserve and an unemployment reserve, things like that, for those kinds of expenses, then you can keep your unassigned fund balance between 10 and 20. But if a major expense comes forward, you want to do a major addition to the town hall, you want to buy a major vehicle, you're not using your fund balance, you're using your capital reserves. Okay, so it's just something to think about in terms of fund balance management, which is something the town hasn't really had to do because for so long the fund balance was so low. But now in the last couple of years, you're sort of in a different phase in terms of deciding, how you want to manage your fund balance rather than saying how you're going to get out of a fund deficit.
So in my layman's terms, that's allocating some of the reserves, earmarking it for a very specific purpose, like you said, vehicles, highway department trucks, etc., roof repairs, whatever, and that reduces fund balance, but also makes those the funds that are allocated earmarked and set aside for those specific purposes. Is that fairly accurate?
It shows why you could have a huge fund balance, but if you're showing well, 80,000 is for this reserve and 100,000 for this reserve, then you're explaining what you're using that money for. What a lot of municipalities do is they are planning for that stuff, but they just don't want to go through the hoops to set up reserves, so they just keep it in unassigned fund balance, meaning that there's no statutory limit for it. But it's usually ideal not only for planning purposes to set up those reserves, but also when someone's reviewing your financials, the state controller is going to assume, well, what are you just sitting on this money? What are your plans for? And especially like in highway funds, it's good to have capital reserves. You're always buying new trucks, things like that. So it's a good sort of reserve to set up the reserve now that you have the fund balance. So it's something that like a town, I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. you think about moving forward, setting up some reserves. I know you did some of that in 2020 with your compensated absences. This is
Andrew? No, Andrew, once you have, I mean, it's good to have a sort of generally titled reserve fund, right? I mean, you were talking, you wouldn't want to say reserve for trucks or things like that. It would be for capital expenditures, because once it's in the reserve fund, that's what it has to be used for.
Yeah, normally you'll see, if you set up a capital reserve, you would just say they have what's called a specific or a general reserve. So if you want a specific reserve, you could set up a reserve and say, we want to buy a Ford F-450, four-wheel drive, exactly what you're buying, and then when you build up enough money in the reserve, you buy that exact truck. I don't see any reason to do that. I'm just set it up as a capital reserve, put the money in it, but then when you're ready to spend it, when you spend it, you have to pass a resolution saying what you're buying with it. It has to be subject to a permissive referendum. Now, that just means you advertise it in the paper, and people have 30 days to come forward with a petition saying they want it to go to a voter referendum. I've never seen that happen in my 20-some odd years doing this. I've spoken to people in state control who have never seen it happen. It's really just a formality you have to go to. It's not like school districts. No, school districts have to go to voter to spend that capital reserve money. So they have some more hoops to jump from. Towns don't. Towns just, town board, if you set up a capital reserve, you just say, we want to spend $30,000 for a truck, subject to permissive referendum, you advertise it in newspapers, and 30 days later you can act on that and buy your truck. So it's not that difficult to get money out of a reserve in the municipalities.
Thanks.
Well, I'm glad you explained that 30-day lag time and the noticing of a permissive referendum. I actually did not know that. I had assumed that if you did earmark the money, you already had kind of declared the town board's intention. But that's why we're here, to learn.
Well, the permissive referendum is only for the capital reserve. Now, like if you wanted to set up, the funny thing about it is you can set up a capital reserve with board approval, then you do the permissive referendum once you decide what you're going to buy with it. If you want to set up a specific reserve, then you do the permissive referendum first, saying we're going to set up a reserve for a Ford F-450, and then when you spend it, you don't have to do it. At some point, you have to do the permissive referendum only for the capital reserve. It's not for all reserves. So a reserve for to pay out people retired, to pay out their accrued sick and vacation, you don't need permissive referendum for that. That once the board sets it up, that's what the reserve is there. It's only the capital reserve that you need that permissive referendum.
Thank you. That clarifies a lot for me.
Okay. The fund balance and agenda, this chart, I wanted just to show you again the relationship between the non-spendable and the unassigned. If you look at the yellow line, you see the total fund balance and agenda fund has gone up pretty steady over the last few years. But the big increase in your unassigned fund balance, that was because your non-spendable fund balance dropped dramatically, and the non-spendable fund balance was made up of the huge deficit in your general B fund. With the general A fund had to loan the money to the B fund. So if you go back to like 2016, even though the general fund may have had $1 million in fund balance, all of that was non-spendable because basically it was all money loaned to the general B fund and they had no fund balance at the time. So that's why it would look like your unassigned fund balance was actually negative at that time, even though you had close to $1 million in fund balance. So as the general B fund was able to eliminate their deficit, the general A fund's financial position really increased and made it look exponentially. Because not only was their fund balance going up, but now the unassigned fund balance was sort of getting turbocharged. But now they had the availability of this money that they had loaned to the general B fund, where the general B is able now to pay them back the money that they owe.
So those loans between funds, I had a thought in my head that they had to be paid back by the end of the year. Where did I get that idea from?
Yes, most normal times they are. You're supposed to pay them back. I will say, in practice, what the state controller will say is, when they see the loans, are you planning to pay them within the next year? They'll ask. So you just don't want, what you don't want to see is these interfund loans just sitting there for years and years. And we see that you guys are pretty good. Your interfund you clean up, throughout the course of the year. But some municipalities will have due tos and due froms between funds, and they just sit there. They have the money to pay them back, but they just don't think about them, and they sit on the books for years. And the state controller has been looking at that a lot more specifically on the AUDs every year. They look at the interfunds and they'll say, are these loans going to be paid back within a year, if they're large? You guys really at this point don't have any large loans. But back in the days when you did, when the general B fund was in a deficit and had borrowed $1 million from the A fund or $800,000 from the A fund, those were loans that the state controller would ask, is this going to get paid back within the next year? And the answer was no. because the B fund took time to be able to get that money to be able to pay them back. But at this point,
Thank you.
and here's your general B fund. You had a total fund balance increase of $719,000 and a total fund balance of $752,000. The non-spendable fund balance in the B fund is $40,000. That's represented by a prepaid insurance expense, is what that is. You still didn't prepay the PFRS and the ERS. So again, I still would recommend you do that in the general B fund. The other prepaid, I think, is health insurance, and there's also a lease you do with Goosetown Communications that runs over a couple of 2 years. So that's what represents your prepaid expenses. And you have an unappropriated fund balance of $712, which represents about 25% of the subsequent year's budgeted expenditures. And as you see, last year you were at negative. So this is the first year where the general B fund actually has that positive fund balance that they have going forward. It's about 25% of the subsequent year's budget. And the deficit was eliminated through the budget process. The town board did a good job of building in a deficit reduction line right into the budget every year. So they were raising money and not spending it. So it's just a way, it's we call it other budgetary purposes. It's a way of raising money to eliminate a deficit. And there's your general B fund, just pretty much what we spoke about, sort of straight up. You saw how deep the hole was back in 15, $1.2 million deficit. And the town has done a good job of getting out of that quickly. Now, a lot of that was not obviously just the budgeting for the deficit reduction. I know the town made a lot of cuts. When you made a lot of those cuts in the salaries, it also then reduces your retirement expenses. Everything sort of goes together with that. And I know the town made a lot of tough decisions to sort of right the ship over the last few years. But these are the results of what the town did. Your highway DA fund, which is your townwide highway, has a fund balance increase of $5,800 and a total fund balance of $464,000. The DA fund used $35,000 towards the next year's budget and had no non-spendable fund balances, and had an unappropriated fund balance of $429,000. So your DA fund you're at about 54% of the subsequent year's expenses. Last year was about 60. So that came down this year, even though your fund balance went up, and that's pretty much because you use some of the fund balance in next year's budget. So even though your fund balance went up, you used $35,000 towards the 2020 budget. So that's why your unappropriated fund balance actually went down. When you look at a highway DA fund, sometimes when you look at those percentages, just remember that a highway DA fund can be very volatile. You have a bad winter, you have a lot of fuel costs, you have a lot of snow removal costs, overtime costs can happen in a highway DA fund. If you're having mild winters, it's great. You can build up fund balance. But if you have bad winters, it can go down very quickly. So always keep that in mind. And also think about it in terms of purchasing vehicles and trucks. It's a good fund to have a capital reserve in to purchase vehicles. Then you don't have to worry about budgeting for them. One of the things I always like to recommend is building right into your budget $20,000 or $30,000 to fund a reserve every year. So you're raising money every year to put it in reserve. So it's $20,000 one year, then it's $4,000. And then when you pay to buy a vehicle, you just buy it with that reserve money. You don't have to worry about budgeting for it or anything. You just use the reserve to buy the vehicle. So it's something to think about.
Well, we do have an aging fleet of trucks at the highway department, so it's certainly something the town board needs to consider.
Right. Something. I mean, in the beginning, before you get that, I mean, obviously, installment purchase contracts are good, and a lot of towns do that to buy vehicles. But if you have a healthy fund balance, it's always good to have some money in those reserves. Highway funds always need money. Your highway DB fund, which is your outside fund, had an increase of $71,000. Total fund balance of $415,000, and the DB fund used $50,000 towards the 2020 budget. Now that the town has sort of built up some fund balance, it gives you some flexibility when you're doing your budget, that if you need to balance your budget, especially with the tax cap now that you can't exceed, you can use fund balance now to help balance your budget. And that's a great sort of a flexibility to have that town never had before. When you first came in, you had deficits, your budget had to balance. You had no leeway. Here now, you do your budget, you're off by 50, you can plug using fund balance. When you want to watch that, you don't want to have to do it every year to deplete your fund balance. But in this case, you certainly can use some of that fund balance and it helps you. DB funds have no non-spendable fund balances and an unappropriated fund balance of $365,000. And there you see 60 and 61% of your subsequent year's expenses. And there's your two highway funds over the last 5 years. You see the same thing, big increases Highway DA, you had the big increase, you got out of it, sort of leveled off, which is kind of nice. Once you've got to where you want to be, you sort of want to see those fund balances leveling off. There's no reason for them just to keep skyrocketing forever. At some point, you've eliminated your deficits, you have a cushion, you sort of want to see them sort of break even now moving forward and level off like that. And these are your fund balance trends over the last 5 years. You see it back in 15. The town as a whole had a negative $263,000 fund balance back in 2015. And now this year you ended with $3.7 million. So that is a quite remarkable turnaround the town has made over 5 years to put yourself in a totally different position than where you were back in 2015. For the fund balances, town's done a great job improving its financial position. Deficits have been eliminated. Just continue to monitor those fund balances. Sometimes you're looking at them for different reasons now. Now, as town board, you may be looking at fund balances. Are they getting too high? That kind of a thing. Should we adjust the budget accordingly? Should we fund reserves? Things we can do with the fund balance. Whereas previously you were trying to get out of deficits, now you have a sort of a different goal to look at when looking at your fund balances. But also just watch them if they start going down. One of the important things is always look at trends. Sometimes it sneaks up on you. You think you have a lot of fund balance. It goes down 50,000 one year, it goes down 60,000 next year. Before you know it, you have a bad year and you're in a deficit again. You always want to watch those fund balances every year. We talked about the reserves. Really consider funding them. You have the excess fund balance. There's two ways of doing it. You can build it in your budget. You can say, budget, we're going to put 10,000 or 20,000 a year into each of these reserves. Or at the end of the year, if you have money, the board can just say, we want to put, $50,000 into this reserve. Once it's been established, you have to establish the reserve first of all. But you can set up, there's various reserves that you can set up. The most common being the capital reserve, obviously. The budgeting, really, the town has done a much better job of adopting realistic budgets. You have the reduction lines included, which is great to put into a budget to sort of reduce those deficits. Then as you reduce those deficits, now you have that cushion in your budget to use for other things, either funding your budget or whatever funding your reserves or whatever you want to do with that money. I know you've been monitoring the activity closely throughout the year. You look at the reports throughout the year. And that's very important, those monthly reports, and see when a budget line looks like it's getting close to being over or goes over. Because if you ignore that, by the end of the year, if it's over by 100,000, that's going to cause your fund balance to go down 100,000. So you need to look at those ahead of time and address them as it's happening. Make the modification as needed. I spoke about prepaying the repayment bills. Make sure you do that. Look for ways to invest the money. I mean, I know the interest rates went up there for a while. They're back down again. But if there's any way you can get, some better interest rate on your cash now, again, you can earn, free money. With the beginning of the year, you have a lot of money. Even at the end of the year, you have several million in the bank. Even at 1%, you can earn a decent amount of interest on that money. So certainly look to see if you can use it to your advantage moving forward.
So how about paying back some of the long-term debt, like for the Quarry Field property, those kind of things? Would that be a consideration we should be?
Yeah. Normally when you look at that, the first of all, you have to make sure you can. Not all make sure that you can pay it early and pay it off. And then usually what you look at is, can you earn more interest? No, than the thing is. And right now, I would guess, because of when the Quarry Field loan bond was done, the interest rate now is probably higher than interest rates are that you can earn with your money. So, in theory, that would be a better thing, a better use of your money to save yourself a certain amount percentage on that note. I do have the financials right here. Let me just see what that note is at, the Quarry Field note. But again, you do have to check with bond counsel to make sure that these are notes that can be repaid. Because if you have to go through a refunding, then there's money involved in that. Yeah, the Quarry Field has interest rates between 3 and 4%, and you're certainly not going to earn 3 or 4%, in the bank right now. So that could be a possibility if it's something that you can do, you can pay it. It's just those are things that you can think about to do with that money. But again, remembering that if you do that, you're going to use up a big chunk of your fund balance. In one shot. So you really have to be comfortable that you have enough fund balance to do that before you make a decision like that.
Well, the other big ticket item we're dealing with is the cleanup of the Long Meadow Road property under the consent order of the DEC. And we have already earmarked $250,000 to get that cleanup going. And, so that's been a looming, it's been described as basically a lien on some of our intentions to get loans, especially like municipal financing for vehicles and things like that. So, the DEC has made it clear to me that they expect that cleanup to be happening, and we're trying to get off that consent order that threatens us with up to a $3,000 a day fine if we weren't in compliance. So that's where we're at with that.
Well, certainly that puts you, it's a good thing that you got the fund out. I don't know what something like that would eventually cost you. I mean, if it's $250,000, certainly you can absorb it. If it's significantly more, that might have to be something you borrow for and pay it out over time. But, you're certainly in a much better place to handle something like that now, the town is.
Thank you.
When you look at the financial statements, you'll see in the front of the financial statements, you'll see we have a blended component unit included, and that's the Tuxedo Farms Local Development Corporation. Basically, we only include that in the front part of the audit, basically as a component unit of the town. And that's because the town supervisor appoints the board members of the corporation with the consent of the town board, and the town is a sole member of the corporation. So those are some of the criteria under Government Accounting Standards Board number 80 that would make a component unit a blended component unit. So basically those numbers are just sort of included. They have nothing to do with your fund accounting. So as a town, when you're doing your budget and you're looking at your general fund, your highway fund, Tuxedo Funds has nothing to do with that. That just gets added in those front financial statements where it's the full accrual and it has its own column. So it really doesn't affect you in any way in terms of budgeting or anything like that. And there are separately issued financial statements for the Tuxedo Farms Local Development Corporation. And that has to do with the sewer system construction. Management letter, you'll see a letter in there where we make recommendations for improvement. Now, these would be findings that don't rise to the level. When I spoke earlier about internal controls and compliance, if something was a significant deficiency or a material weakness, that would actually go in the audit report as a finding. If there's things that are not as significant, in the management letter, which is a sort of recommendations for improvement. So if you look in there, there are written comments in there, and we also give management the opportunity to respond to the findings. So if anybody looks at your audit report and sees the findings, they can see what your responses are to those. And then other minor issues we discuss verbally with the business office. Anything we come across, we discuss it. If the verbal issue becomes an issue every year, at some point we need to put it in writing if it's not being addressed. But normally these are things that are just stuff during the course of doing business. And the unmodified opinion on the financial statements means everything is in accordance with generally accepted accounting standards. So the financial statement has all the required components, the pension reporting, the retiree health insurance, all things that are required to be in there are in there. So you get that unmodified opinion. So like I said, overall, the town is in very good financial position right now. Done a good job of getting out of the hole that it was in. And I think just moving forward as a board, you sort of have what's a more enviable position of deciding what you want to do with that. Do you want to fund reserves? What things may have been put off years when things were tough that maybe now the town can take care of moving forward. So does anybody have any questions on the presentation or the actual report?
So the actual report we're referring to is the 70 some odd page document that is the Town of Tuxedo financial statements, December 31st, 2019.
Yep, those are the ones.
Well, I did my best to have read it for this meeting, but fell a little short. Got about 3/4 of the way through. I definitely have some questions. I'm not sure it's totally appropriate for this this forum, but I'd like to open the mic to any other town board member as I'm perusing my notes.
I would just like to point out when you're looking at that report, just remember that pages up to page 12, pages 1 through 12, most of those pages have to do with what we call the full accrual financial statements. And in those financial statements, we're including things like the actuarially calculated pension liability, the actuarially calculated retiree health insurance liability. So those numbers are going to be skewed from what you actually do on a day-to-day basis. And I talk to boards lots of times, I get questions on these numbers, and really as a town board, what you should be looking at is the report starting on page 13. And specifically, the more important reports, and you look through obviously all the notes, and then you look at the reports starting on page 59. So if you look at those reports, those are the reports that have to do with the budget, your tax levy, your fund balances. That's really, as a board member, those are the things you can do. In the other reports, up to page 12, you can't control a lot of what's in there. Those are actuaries calculating numbers based on discount rates and projected health trends, health cost trends. They're there because GASB 34 requires us, but as a town board member, sometimes they can really be, cause more questions than really answers. The other reports are what you should be looking at. Those are the reports that are your general fund, your highway fund, all your different funds and how you're doing. So just something to remember when you're looking through those reports. Don't get bogged down in the first 12 pages of the report.
Well, some of those big ticket pension expenses, medical benefits packages, that's what I'm wrestling with right now, Andrew, to try to understand as we have quite a few employees who are nearing retirement age and trying. It's my understanding that we really can't earmark money for pension costs, but they're looming, and we know they're coming, and so. I know I have a developing understanding of all that, but I think what I'm saying is fairly accurate as far as not being able to earmark money for those expenses. But we know they're looming, and I'm trying to get wrap around understanding, those expected expenses. Sorry, there's some kind of a weird noise going on in my ear, as well as planning for as we replace those employees and are paying those costs that are happening as they're on our payroll. So trying to make sure we're prepared for both of those worlds.
There's no way you can't fund the pensions, because the pensions, are obviously calculated by the state, and you get a bill annually, and you pay your share of your respective share based on your proportion of salaries amongst people in the entire state. You pay your share of that, and the retiree health insurance, you can't fund for that either. Now, the retiree health insurance, basically, that's just based on what your premiums are each year. So that's not, even though they record the entire number in the audit report, really all you're liable for is the premiums the next year. And that's all you're budgeting for. And that's pretty much why the state is saying at this point, there's no really vehicle to fund that liability. And the liability, I just really, if somebody's looking through these notes, and I know they can be very burdensome, when you're looking in the notes about the pension reporting and you're looking in the notes about the retiree health insurance, there's a specific part where it shows you how much that liability changes if the discount rate moves 1 percentage point either way, or the healthcare trend rates move 1 percentage point. And it shows you that number is going to change millions, sometimes tens of millions of dollars if interest rates go up or down. So these are things that are really beyond your control. So that's why I don't want to get too bogged down. Those numbers can change dramatically from year to year, and it has really nothing to do with, how the town is doing as a whole in its funds. So just again, that's why I just want to remind you, there is something you should look at them, because if you have a real high number, it could mean, are we giving away our benefits too generous, that we have this huge liability. That's something to look at, but it really is still not something that you can budget for and pay and fund or anything like that.
Andrew, can I ask you a question? Is this something that, obviously, because of COVID-19, New York State is in worse financial shape than it's been in many years? Is that something that we need to be thinking about in terms of those, like how much of our budget will have to go, what our contribution, will it increase? I mean, should we worry about that, or? I
think everybody, when it comes to COVID-19, should be just concerned, because I don't think any of us know what the ultimate result of COVID-19 is going to be, how it's going to affect me. Now, I will say on those liabilities, I'm not sure how much it will affect you, because the way the New York State pension systems work is they have their money invested, in various, vehicles, in the stock market and things like that. Now, for their case, the stock market has come back pretty much from what it dropped down to. So again, I don't know how that will affect your future contributions to the retirement system. I don't know. It all depends on how the investments did within the retirement system. Like I mentioned, that's really beyond your control. New York State is the one who has the money invested, and then they calculate based on how many people in the system what the benefits are going to be. They calculate how much money they have, and they say, okay, everybody has to pay 20% of their payroll, or everybody has to pay 15% of their payroll. There's not much you can do. Now, whether this COVID-19 is going to cause your contribution rate to go up, I don't know. My guess is it's not going to cause it to go down. You know what I mean? So I don't know what's going to. I do know that the rates come out early. So like next year's rates already haven't changed. So you're not going to get hurt like next year. They come up with rates a year or so in advance, 2 years in advance. So if it does start affecting the rates, it won't be for 2 or 3 years.
Thank you.
So one of our obligations I was seeking some clarification on is the compensated absences. I see it first mentioned on page 15 of our report, the financial statement report. And I see in parentheses, I don't know if you're looking at that page, Andrew, I could wait.
Which page?
Page 15.
Right.
Right in the center of the page. I highlighted on in my page, bracketed out $456,193.
Right. What is it?
Yeah, just what,
That's
I want to be able to explain that number.
The compensated absences is a number that it basically is all of your, for all of your employees, what their potential payouts would be. And when we do compensated absences, we look at everybody's accrued sick and vacation time to calculate what the potential payout is for the municipality. Now with sick time, you only calculate if the contract says the person gets paid cash. Because basically our standards say you can't assume someone's going to get sick. So someone could have 1,000 hours of accrued sick time, but if the town policy is you use it for sick time or you lose it, then we don't accrue any of that. We only accrue if town policy says we pay out 50% of your accrued sick time. We calculate that, we do it. Vacation time, you always accrue. You always assume that everybody's going to use their vacation. So basically, you look at that number, you think it's all the town employees and what they have accrued in sick and vacation time at the end of the year. That's a potential liability. That number, again, will move up and down depending on whether people use their sick time or they accrue more sick time, and the pay rates change. They'll sort of go up and down, as you go. And there is a reserve that you can set up for that. There's a compensated absence reserve that the town can set up and put money in.
Yeah, we made some contribution to that. I think it was $175,000. And I would imagine that the sick calculation is different based on the contracts between the highway and the police, obviously the big ones. And
all the contracts, we have, all the contracts are different. Some will pay out sick time, some won't pay out sick, some will pay a percentage of sick time. So we do have to look at all the contracts to see what the payout provisions are to calculate the compensated absences.
And then also how much can be carried forward. I know in some organizations they say they block it at 5 weeks or something like that, either use it or lose it, so that the liability doesn't continue to skyrocket and get to a point where an organization would be very hard hit if they had to pay it all out.
What we see a lot, and I'm not sure, I can't off the top of my head remember how you do it, but what we see a lot is it'll say something like your payout provisions for your sick time is capped at say 1,000 hours and we'll pay you 50%, whatever. You can accrue more, and then if you get sick, you can use it, but will only pay out up to a certain amount for what you're saying, so you don't get these huge liabilities at the end of somebody leaving the municipality. But you're right, they're all different depending on the contract.
Andrew, did you say when you calculated that number that you did look into each of the different contracts and that's how you got to that number?
Yeah, we have to look at each contract to see what those provisions are, because some contracts don't pay out sick time. If you don't pay it out, nothing gets accrued. It all depends on, and then we have to look for the limits, limits as to how many hours could be accrued. So everybody's different. Luckily in the towns, it's not too bad, not too many contracts. You go into the schools and you have, 18 different contracts for the different people, but that's what we have to do, yes.
Okay, I'd like to go back to that question Maria asked about the retirement and our contribution. When is that determined a certain month each year?
actually, no, it's already determined actually what your rate is. So the rate that the payment that you have coming up due this next February, which you can pay Friday in December for the discount, that rate has already been set. So basically, it's a certain percentage of your salaries.
Now, when does that get set? So, I mean, you can have an idea what, is there a specific time? Or?
I'm not sure, I don't know when, but it's usually at least a year in advance, they come out with those rates. So you can look and see what the rates are going to be. For the rates for February of 2022, I'm not sure when, maybe, I don't know if Brian knows, but I'm not sure exactly when they come out with them, but they do come out with them pretty far in advance.
Thanks.
And you can go on the retirement websites, local retirement websites in New York State, and just look at the employer section, and there's a tab you can go right on. It gives you the whole history of the rates, and it'll tell you, there's a chart they give you, and it gives you the last 4 years rates and what the projected next year's rates, so you can look at when you're trying to calculate what it's looking like moving forward.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, they're working on their new website, Michelle. I'm not sure if they finished yet, so as soon as that's finished, we'll be able to just log on to it and get those rates.
Thanks.
So, Andrew, I'm going to follow up again on my compensated absences. It resurfaces again on page 18 and has more annual figures, and I'm just curious how I would explain the difference between 2018 and 2019, the big swing there.
So basically, on page 18, you're looking at the change in the compensated absences. So that's the 64,000 represents, because these are two different charts. These were reconciling to the full accrual. So your compensated absences would have changed by $64,000. Again, normally when we're looking at compensated absences, we analyze those changes. If you want to look at an easier way to look at your compensated absences, if you look on page 38, that shows actually your compensated absences went up 64,000. If you look at page 38, that'll show you how your compensated absences you change during the year. Now, probably a good portion of that is going to be people's salaries, people earning more time. That's basically what will change those amounts.
So I guess that lower number means people might have used their sick time and vacation time, and so just carry forward. So it's no longer a liability; they've been paid.
Right. Normally, a compensated absence will go down if you have a couple of big employees who will retire and get paid out big amounts, so they're no longer carried as compensated absence. For the most part, the normal thing for compensated absences, people's pay rates go up and they accrue more time. So it sort of compounds itself, and it usually goes up most years, unless you have a year where you have some really high earners retire where it goes down. Otherwise, most of the time, you'll see the compensated absences be going up each year.
Well, one of the things I noticed about the compensated absence, I'm trying to find where this is in your report, but that it's calculated at the rate of pay in the year. It was, I think it's on page 26. The compensated absences liability is calculated on the pay rates in effect at year end. Right. So if somebody retired, I'll just throw a number, they were owed 100 hours and they're making their top salary when they retire. They don't get 100 hours at that hourly rate, so to speak. It was factored in over the course of their career. That's what I'm interpreting that statement to mean.
The compensated absence is calculated at a point in time. So basically, if somebody accumulates 10 hours a year for 20 years, and now they have 200 hours at the 20th year, that 200 hours is calculated based on the pay rate in effect on the final year. So,
at the final year. So
it doesn't matter when you accumulated them; it's calculated on the pay rate on that. That's why, like I'm saying, as people accumulate, if someone accumulates a lot of time from one year to the next, not only did they accumulate more time, but now you're using a different pay rate. So that's why those amounts go. Because that's what you're going to pay them out when they leave. You're going to pay them based on the current pay rate. That's the number you use.
Well, I guess that's why a lot of organizations then restrict how many hours you can carry forward, because it's like a bank. It's like if you're making more money, the more hours you can bank.
Yep.
You're cashing it in at your highest possible,
Right. A lot of people, a lot of municipalities will pay $50 a day. They'll use numbers like that rather than using whatever the pay rate is. They'll just say we're going to pay out, and I've seen, some small ones, $5 a day. I mean, almost just token payouts. It's really nothing. It all depends on the municipality, how the contracts are sort of written in terms of how you do your payout. It can be anything from, I've seen, straight payout, whatever your rate is, up to whatever hours you have, that's your payout, to we don't pay it out. I mean, it goes the whole spectrum of what the contracts say.
And I would think usually there's a difference in the payout between, or maybe a formula between vacation time and sick time. I know a lot of places, I'm not sure if this is the law or just a policy, that vacation time you're paid basically in entirety, or sick time you might get basically 10 cents on the dollar or something along those lines. So.
Yeah, if there's limits as to 50% or $50 a day, it's always on the sick time. If vacation gets paid out, whatever your vacation time is, you're going to get paid out for it. Sick time is the only one that gets limited.
Thank you.
And Ken, those are stated in the police and highway contracts what they are. They're not percentages.
Yeah, well, that's something to consider as you negotiate contracts for new members, as opposed to people who are already covered by a contract. Andrew, I had a question. I'm just flipping pages, so there's not going to be any real continuity in some of these questions. Unfortunately, maybe. I'm looking at page 32 of your report.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just looking at a general question of what I wrote here on the side. It's talking about activities, statement of activities.
Right.
And I wrote a question. Can you give me an example of an activity?
Well, the statement of activities is just one of the. It's not necessarily. I mean, the activities, what the town's activities is public safety, home and community services, general government support, transportation. That's pretty much what the town's activities are. But what the statement of activities is, that's just the name of the report in the front of it that I mentioned, that full report. It's called the statement of activity. Whereas when you're looking at your funds, it's called the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in fund balance. When you're looking at the full accrual, that includes your compensated absences, your retiree health insurance, your pensions. That report is called the statement of activities. That's just the name of the report.
I see. So it's these categories of expenses and allocations, but like you said, public safety, et cetera.
That's the definition of those is really the functional expenses, those categories. But if you look if you ask them what activities the town does, that's the activities, whether it be transportation for highway or home community for water and sewer, that kind of a thing. That's what the activities are.
Yeah, I got a little hung up on that word activities, like it was. So that's helpful to me. Thank you. Then on the same page, there's a number 1 there under letter B. Long-term revenue and expenditure differences arise because governmental funds report revenues only when they are considered available, whereas the statement of activities report revenues when earned. I wrote when earned, when received. As this would a grant fall into this kind of thing where you don't immediately get the money?
Well, grant, normally when we talk about available for governmental funds, and again, when I say government, I'm talking about your funds, your general fund, your highway fund. Available means you're going to receive it within the next year. So basically, I mentioned about why we call the receivables non-current receivables, and we deem them to be non-spendable, is if you're not going to get that money within a year. On the statement of activities, which is based on your full accrual statements, they don't care when you're going to. If you're going to get that money, just like with your liabilities, it's reported as a revenue regardless of when you receive it. But I do want to point out there is something different with grants, because grants, even though most of the time you're going to receive that grant money within a year, we have what's called the matching principle when it comes to grants. So normally, if you have a grant that says I have to spend $50,000 to get $50,000, So let's assume you spend the 50,000 in 2019, but you're not going to get the other 50,000 until 2021, say. We still want to report that revenue and receivable because we want to match it. We want to show that this expense was tied to this revenue. If we show the expense in 1 year and then we show the revenue 2 years later, it sort of skews the town's activity. So there is a matching principle when it comes to grants, that you want to make sure the revenue and the expense shows up in the same year. But normally that's the grant revenue you are going to get within a year most of the time anyway. So you wouldn't have to do that. But available generally means within the next fiscal year.
Thank you. I know I'm going to have more questions, but this has been very helpful for me. Thank you, Andrew.
If you have questions, shoot me an email. Include everybody. I'll be more than happy to respond if you have questions, by email.
Colleagues, any questions for illustrious auditor?
I just had a couple of questions got answered. Thank you.
Did it have to do with grants?
Yes.
Good. Because we need to understand that process.
And just about the grants, the reason it's so important is because if you're going to spend as a municipality, let's assume you get a grant for $100,000 to spend on something. You don't want to mess up your budget. So as a budget, what you're going to do is you're going to show a budgeted expense for 100 and a budgeted revenue for 100. So it doesn't, you're not messing up your budget. You don't have to raise that 100 from some other source. You don't have to get it from tax revenue. So you want to match the revenue and the expense in your budget. So it's not none of the local money that's being used. And then that's why we want to also show the actual revenue and the actual expense in the same time. So just remember, if you're thinking about a grant that's coming in, I think we had it a couple of years ago when you had the issue with the truck, I think it was, Brian, where you were going to get money from the state to pay the truck early. If you have a grant revenue that's coming in, just remember, you make your budget modification. It's just whatever the new expense is and whatever the revenue is. It's just they should just offset each other, but they should be in your budget, so you're aware that you're expecting that money.
Well, one of the things that's coming up now is possible funding through Homeland Security related to COVID expenses. And, I know about this much about it right now, but I'm under the understanding that Tuxedo, there's a minimal threshold that we'd have to apply for. I seem to remember somewhere around $135,000. And that, we've had some obviously expenses that would have not arose without COVID-19. And I'm understanding that that's what we're trying to do right now is look to get compensated for these expenses and identify expenses that would be, approvable under this process. Lieutenant Norton is working on this, and so I'd be remiss if I couldn't learn a little bit about in this exchange as to, if what we should be thinking about that, or.
Yeah, anything you can get. I'm not sure whatever's available out there, whatever reimbursement forms have to be submitted to try to get some money for COVID expenses. Whether it's based on certain expenses or salaries or things you had to do, get them out there. I wouldn't budget obviously or book a receivable until you know for sure you're going to get it. Everything obviously is up in the air, so don't count on any money. Assume you're not going to get it until you know you're going to get it.
Yeah, that's my pretty much position on that. Don't spend like a drunken sailor expecting to, we'll get this money back, so let's buy, X, Y, and Z. Obviously, that kind of funding is intended to help municipalities deal with real unforeseen expenditures, and obviously it's not meant to just go crazy spending money trying to identify stuff, but of course there are some real expenses. I don't know if it rises to the threshold of $135,000 at this point, but I think your advice is, listen, assume you won't get it so that you, if I'm hearing you correctly, and if you do, it's great, but this is supposed to be for expenses that you absolutely had to incur because of the emergency situation.
Right, and if you can identify those, I absolutely would submit for them. If you can identify those expenses that are expenses you wouldn't normally, a lot of like the payroll expenses. If you already budgeted your payroll and nobody worked extra overtime or anything, I don't know really how you claim that because they still were working. But anything you can identify, I mean, so we tell that to our business clients too with the PPP loans and all that stuff. Certainly if you think you're entitled to it, claim it and see what happens. It never hurts to try to get it.
The cleaning contracts would be under that, right? It's expensive now to get all our buildings cleaned up to the level that, that it's compliant to COVID-19.
That would be something easily identifiable. You're right. You can identify costs you spent to cleaning companies to do extra cleaning. If that's something, I don't know what exactly they're reimbursing for, but if that's one of the things, that seems like it might be something that's easily identifiable. If the vendor we paid to come in and do extra cleaning and those costs.
Well, we've done some extra cleaning and, an expense hopefully you'd want to get reimbursed for. But also, the expectation that that's the new normal, that you have to pay that. And I'm not sure how that would factor in, the future expected expenses, but I guess we'd really have to dig into that. But I would tend to think not in that category. It's kind of like
the same boat. We're not sure how it's going to play out. We don't know what money's going to be available, how towns are going to be affected, how badly sales tax is going to be affected. I've seen a lot of municipalities say their mortgage tax, they've been getting a lot of money in mortgage tax, more than they got. So that for people, I guess, are out there buying, interest rates are down, their mortgage rate, they're getting a lot of mortgage tax. Sales tax, we won't know, until this thing plays out, how badly you're going to get hurt on sales tax. So it's really, again, we just don't know until the whole thing plays itself out.
Yeah, one of my worries is possible defaults on people who can't pay their mortgages. And, to my understanding, the county is, I guess, responsible to cover us. But my fear would be, well, I would imagine that calculation is dependent on a typical year. And if there was a tsunami of people, not paying, where would the county get the money from to reimburse us? I don't know. I'm just trying to anticipate any possibility that we could be prepared for. How do they pay us if they don't get it? And then even when it gets to schools, okay, we pay our school tax, but how about all the state aid and stuff that most likely is going to be reduced dramatically? Federal aid to schools, still. Most of the expenses of the schools are still going to be there. Somebody's got to pick it up.
Yeah. Yep.
So if people open those envelopes and see the taxes go up, hopefully they look at the categories and see that, well, it didn't come from my town tax. Where did it come from? Don't shoot us. We're trying our best to keep it down. Any other questions for Andrew? Guys? At this point don't, and he offered us obviously to email him any questions. And
I have a question. I'm sorry,
no, please go ahead.
Okay, the tax settlements that we've had, do they impact next year or I mean, this doesn't have anything to do with the audited results, but
Which tax? The tax certiorari cases?
yes.
You've actually paid out. We talk about just adjusted tax bills. You actually paid out tax certiorari.
Well, that's what Brian. Can you illuminate us on that?
I haven't paid anything out yet.
Okay, but if we
I
have,
don't even know what the results of the cases are. Jimbo will let us know that. And they're usually due within 30 days of when we're billed by the county.
okay.
When that exactly is, I don't know. I don't know yet.
So the one that we approved last public meeting, we accepted that.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to wait for the county to.
That's my understanding. Yeah, I sent an email to Jim. I haven't heard back yet.
Okay, thanks.
send us a chargeback notice.
But that, we have to pay that out now, or does that, is
Yeah.
that
It's,
prospective?
I think it's 30 days, Michelle. Don't quote me exactly, but yeah,
Thanks.
it pretty much comes in and you got to pay it right away.
Okay.
No worries, but this is being recorded. Just a joke. Thank you. Okay, again, no further questions for Andrew. I think I'm going to pause for 5 seconds because sometimes a question comes up. What's the wait time, Maria, on a question from educators? I think you're supposed to give at least 5 seconds.
Yep, 5 seconds.
All right, the 5 seconds has elapsed. Andrew, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And again, feel free, any questions, send it, copy everybody. I'll reply all and everyone can get the answer to the question.
Thank you, sir.
Okay?
I'm
Thank you.
sure
Pleasure
we
working
will
with
have
you.
more questions.
Okay, take care.
Fine, thank you.
So, Michelle, if you want to segue us into our second agenda item.
Sure.
Hope-
So I've been trying to find out, and I believe I've gotten the right answer. I hope it's the right answer, that the 2020 consolidated funding process has been delayed indefinitely because of COVID. But since we had the public hearing scheduled for tonight, and I had received some comments directly from residents, and as part of the Economic Development Committee, we have a subcommittee called the Town Center Committee, and got some good comments from them. So the plan, or the 2019 application, was sent out so people could review it and comment. And so I'd like to open the hearing. Should I explain the whole process a little bit more before I open the hearing? I certainly can do that. Okay, thumbs up. All right, so in a nutshell, the 2019 Consolidated Funding Application, I'll subsequently call it the CFA, focused on finding parking in the Hamlet Business District. That has been a focus of town center studies in the past. And we also applied for funds to expand our town center studies and see, so that we could come up with a plan for infrastructure in the downtown business district for streetscapes and making the town more pedestrian friendly. So those are the two things we applied for in 2019, and we'll do that again this year as soon as the process opens. What we'll add to this year's application is the engineered drawings that were done by Fusco Engineering that focused on changing the direction of traffic in the Hamlet Business District and finding additional on-street parking for all local, the Hamlet businesses and the library. And since we have the opportunity, and I have been talking with the post office about the property they own just south of the post office building, Al Fusco, if the town agrees, would develop just a very preliminary sketch for that, and that sketch would cost $500, and we would put that into the grant application as well. So it's parking, and then it's also money for improved studies of how best to improve the infrastructure downtown. We have town center studies. One was done in 2003. Then Related Company did one around 2012, I think, and Tuxedo Hudson did one maybe around 2015. So it would be very helpful to take all those plans and take the best from each plan and put one together. So that's that. background on what the public hearing is all about, I'll open the public hearing. And how shall we do that, Dave? Let's see, Dave?
Okay, I'm here.
I guess we'll see if people.
We start with a chat, see if anybody has a question.
If you could send a chat.
And we could turn the microphones on.
Call-in users. Dave, you see the people's names. Do you want to just go through them? You want me to go through them? And I think you have to unmute them?
Go ahead. Well, the call-in users, I don't see the names, but
Right, I know.
You can start with the other people, and then I'll follow you down the list.
Okay, great. So, okay, I'm being challenged. The first one, Ms. Clark.
Hi, the public hearing is to comment on the town economic development or any town topic?
Yeah, the public hearing is about the application that normally happens in July, but it's been delayed indefinitely because of COVID. And what we were applying for is our funds to complete some parking improvements in the Hamlet Business District, and then also to fund a study that kind of combines 3 separate town center studies that have been done already for infrastructure to make the town more pedestrian friendly and to improve streetscapes.
That sounds very exciting for the town, but I wish to discuss other town business. So I presume you do that at the end of the meeting when it's not on the agenda, right?
Well, this meeting is just for the financials and the public hearing, so it's up to Ken. You want to do general?
No, I would actually recommend that our next town board meeting, which is the more regularly recognized meeting, is the following Monday, a week from today. And we would absolutely welcome your participation. This meeting is actually specially advertised for these 2 purposes.
That's no problem. I totally understand. I will see you folks next Monday. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.
For listening. That's really great. We appreciate it.
The only thing I would add is, you can feel free to submit whatever it is that you want to talk about to one of the board members ahead of time if you feel that it has any urgency.
Or the
Okay,
town.
we'll do that. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, what, Dave?
Generally, we have the resident and the questions or comments to the town clerk, and she distributes them. So,
Thank you.
Aoife, if you'd like to do that,
Okay, thank you so much.
you're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Clark.
Okay, so let's just do this, Michelle. I'm going to unmute all 3 callers, and we'll poll them for comments.
All right.
Okay, all 3 call-in users are now unmuted. If any one of you would like to make a comment, please come forward.
It's John McNamara. I don't have anything. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thanks, John. Anybody else going
I
on?
think that was call-in 2.
Yeah, call-in user 2 is John McNamara. 3 and 4, no response. Going once. Going twice. Okay, thank you. Cecily, you're up.
Hi, Cecily.
Sorry. Hi. I don't have any comments on this session either. I will also rejoin next week.
Great. Thank
Okay,
you.
Dale Matola.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Deirdre Murphy, any questions or comments, please?
Yeah, how much is the grant for, the request for?
Yeah, good question. Last year we applied for 100,000. And so it'll be more if, as soon as I get an estimate from the engineer on how much the parking lot by the post office will cost.
Great, thank you.
He hasn't given us that yet, so.
Okay. That was my only question. Thanks.
Good question.
Thanks, Deirdre. Next,
So I guess my question would be, and I'll pause in a second, Dave, is, what's the expense to the town just to apply? Because obviously we're applying, throwing our hat in the ring. I think, Michelle, you and I have discussed that we're also trying to, we did pay for a limited traffic study already. And I think what we were trying to show is that we already have that a lot of the approval for these grants goes from municipalities being able to demonstrate that they're committed to the project that they're seeking money for. So that we've already done some preliminary studies, I think is what we're trying to say is evidence that strengthens our application. Am I phrasing that correctly?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. The last few years, we didn't have any engineering studies to submit. So now that we have some, it does show that we're moving forward. It's definitely strengthens our application.
So we're not just asking for money to expand our study. We're also asking for money to actually contribute to the actual implementation of what we're suggesting. Is that correct?
As far as the parking, those are things we can definitely identify, especially the parking on Store Road and the few parking spaces on Hospital Road that were identified. So the money would definitely go towards that. And then if we decide we want to go forward with the post office parking lot. I call it a post office parking lot, but it's what
I
we're
understand.
doing is leasing that land that's just south of the building.
Right. So we're not just talking about, well, or maybe let me ask, is the expense envisioned that the actual study could be over $100,000, or is there some actual deliverables beyond just the study that we're petitioning for?
I believe that if the study itself was going to be $75,000 in order to develop engineered drawings of streetscapes.
So
that we got last year.
So our out-of-pocket expense, we already have the expenses that we put out for the preliminary parking study. And I guess there's some kind of, obviously we have to pay the engineer to beef up our application, so to speak. Do we have a sense of how much that would cost us to complete this application?
To actually just the application itself?
Yeah, so we're shooting for around $100,000. So my question is, how much do we have to continue to invest to even submit that application?
Well, as you say, we already have the expenses of the vehicle and traffic law changes on Store Road and Library Road, Hospital Road. So it would be, now Al Fusco said he would do a very preliminary sketch for $500.
Okay.
So that would be that. And then he usually charges us about $1,000 to actually submit it, the application.
So right there, we're talking about maybe $1,500, $2,000 to, which could also lead us to not only a better study, but even to recap money we already spent on our earlier preliminary study. So it's kind of like finishing that thought. We have this preliminary study. We have the chance to get something much more detailed that could spark more investment. And so the roll of the dice really is about $1,500, so to speak, if I'm.
Yeah, and I think every year we just strengthen our application more and more. That's where we have to get to, a stronger application without spending a lot of money. And we try to do as much as we possibly can ourselves. Does it, any other board member questions?
No, I don't have any.
Oh, thanks.
I have one question.
It's with me enough, Dave, right?
I have one question. When you're creating a narrative about like why you need this, is it helpful to show like the growth that's happened in the town? Or is it better, like, it seemed like last year was like, the town is struggling to do this and that. But I feel like within this year, we've had a lot of good things happen in the town. Is it something that that should be highlighted? Or is it something that you want to show more of the need as opposed to more of the, accomplishments?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We will certainly talk about Steve's and Augusta properties and the work we did on the zoning law changes that helped the local businesses, as well as the vehicle and traffic study that we did and those engineered drawings. So yeah, no, a lot, but so you have to show what the town has done to help promote growth and the growth that has happened because of our direct actions, as well as the continuing need. I mean, certainly no matter what we do, we need a pedestrian-friendly town. And so streetscapes and complete streets, those types of projects, we still will need, even though there has been growth. Yeah, but that's a good point to say what we have done. And certainly the WebEx, the webinar we had with our elected officials in June, that we could talk about that and kind of the comments that came out of that. And that shows a lot of action on our part to be proactive in economic development. And so we will definitely focus on that. Thank you, Maria.
Yep.
Jay?
There we go. I got no questions at this time.
Okay, thanks. All right, Dave, you want to go down the roster? Let's see if Donna has anything.
Well, we were Donna, yeah. Town Clerk Donna Matthews, any comments or questions, please?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jerry Matola, any questions or comments?
Yes, I do.
Hi,
Can you
Jerry.
hear me?
Yes,
Go
we
ahead.
can. Thank you.
You mentioned parking on Store Road and Library Road. I remember at one of the last town board meetings at the town hall, we discussed how there is a lack of space for parking on either Store Road or Library Road, such that being basically 20 feet wide, most of the spots on Store Road, and taking away Mr. Stevens's right to use his sidewalk to let his residents go in and out of their building, and things of that nature.
It was the engineer came up with a solution for those residents that there would be a sidewalk. Right now, it just goes straight out to the street, and it would go directly to their parking lot. So we could park there on the street if we decide to park on that side of the street.
Well, I mean, width of the road is at the most 24 feet.
Well, we don't know that because part of the money would go towards doing a detailed survey. So we don't really know that yet until we have the money to do the survey.
Okay, I mean, it's...
I guess I would respond, Jerry, by saying, obviously, we didn't take any action on that. It was a preliminary study. We did a public hearing to get some input, and I can assure you that's why we're continuing this process, that we're seeking a very detailed analysis, and nothing will happen without direct consult with those most affected. So I definitely hear your input, and And so hopefully.
It's hard to know until we have a survey, right?
Right. Any other questions or comments, Jerry?
No,
Thank you, but thanks for your help with the post office too.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Okay, Mary Gretzer, questions or comments, please?
No, none for me, Dave, thanks.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Village Trustee Paul Gluck. Good evening,
Certainly.
sir.
Do I have to unmute my?
I got you. I had you unmuted.
All right, thank you. I had not actually intended to comment on this at all, but I think moving forward to creating a more business and pedestrian-friendly town center and collecting all the ideas that have been generated in the past and regenerating them certainly sounds worthwhile to me, and I applaud the town for moving or seeking to move forward in that direction. I think it's a good idea.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
I think that's it.
And that's it. Yes, we've
All right.
completed the list.
So the next step is to continue, taking comments, and we can still receive comments for 10 days. Is that the normal?
Generally, yeah.
Donna?
Mhm.
So any other comments? If you come up with anything after this, just send your comments to Donna and she'll pass them on to us. And we'll just continue to get the application ready. And when they open up the process, we'll be ready to go. So we can,
Thank you. So I don't think we're actually closing the public hearing because we've extended that 10-day option for comment. Maybe we could do it for 7 days so that we could actually end this next Monday if necessary.
Okay, let's do that.
So can we amend that, Donna, that we'll accept public comment until July 27th at our town board meeting? And we could reiterate it at our town board meeting that the public hearing is still open. Any comments? We're not going to go through a whole big process again, but just make sure that people understand that the hearing is still open until next Monday. And we could use that date to actually close this process as well.
Sounds good. So we don't have to take a vote on anything right now, right? I mean, as far as continuing.
Right. That would be my understanding, that just make a note that we're continuing this through next Monday when we expect this to be the final closing on this topic.
Thank you.
So that was our two matters for this evening, and I would like to respect that we keep to the two matters that we've held this this special meeting for. As we advised a few people, they should, if they have anything outside of this purview of these two topics, you could always send them to the town clerk ahead of time, or just show up at our meeting next Monday, and there's always a section for public comments, both on agenda items and in general. So
Ken, I just have one final closing comment in regards to item number 1.
please go ahead.
I would like to say that I was very satisfied watching Andrew go through that financial report. 6.5 years I'm on this board. Of course, when I came in, we were in the cesspool financially. There were some very, very difficult decisions to be made. But as you can quite clearly see, the result of some of those hard decisions and the continued support of board members throughout that period, including Michelle, who was there early on, and yourself, Ken, through the last 2 budget years. I just want to say I'm looking forward to keeping it that way. I don't want to go backwards, and I think we have a responsible board, and I think that the future looks positive, barring COVID. and whatever it may bring to our table as a beat down, we're not sure of yet, but I'll tell you that certainly is very satisfying to see that report. I just wanted to close out with that.
Well, I'll add to that, and I appreciate that it's notice well due. And our previous supervisor, Mike Ross, definitely had a major role in moving that needle in the positive direction. So I'd like to say publicly thanks to Mike for his efforts on that. And I also pledge, as you do, Dave, to keep that financial impact moving in the right direction. Absolutely. We all need to be able to afford to live here and keep our taxes where they need to be.
Amen. Thank
So
you.
thank you. I think it's time for the ever popular adjournment. I'd like to make a motion to adjourn this meeting at 8:31 on Monday, July 20th. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, I'm going to do the roll call vote. I'll start with you, Michelle.
Aye.
I'll say myself, Ken English, Supervisor. Aye. Towards the adjournment. Dave McMillan.
Aye.
Maria May.
Aye.
And Jay Reichcott.
Aye.
So thank you, Donna. 8:32, meeting adjourned. Be well, everybody. Now I can eat. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.